Hello everyone. Are you struggling with huge data on your spreadsheet and wondering how to deal with it? Well, today we'll learn how to reorganize and simplify our data for ourselves using pivot tables. So let's start from the very basics of pivot tables. Introduction to pivot tables in Excel. A pivot table is an interactive way to quickly summarize, sort, reorganize, group, count, or total data stored in a table. A normal table is fixed while a pivot table is flexible. It allows us to transform columns into rows and rows into columns. You can use a pivot table to analyze numerical data in detail and answer unanticipated questions about your data. A pivot table is especially designed for querying large amounts of data in many user-friendly ways. Let's learn how to create a pivot table with our data set. Pivot table basics. Inserting a pivot table. Click any single cell inside the data set and select the entire table. It is important that the data set has headings and no missing values. On the Insert tab in the Tables group, click Pivot Table. The following dialog box appears. Excel automatically selects the data for you. The default location for a new pivot table is New Worksheet. Click OK. Empty table and field panes. On the left-hand side, what we see is the empty pivot table. On the right, the pivot table fields pane appears. It is divided into 4 sections: rows, columns, filters, and values. If you look carefully, you can see all the fields listed in the Fields pane. If you directly select the fields using checkboxes, then sometimes it may not make sense. To make things simpler, right-click on the pivot table and enable display settings. This will not only make things more understandable, but it also enables drag and drop. What you see on the pivot table are 4 sections: rows, columns, values, and filters. Layout. It is the same as the divisions you see on the Fields pane on the right. The rows, columns, values, and filter. We can now fill our table by either dragging and dropping on the pivot table or the Fields pane. It is the same thing. Pivot table. Example 1. Single-dimensional pivot table. A single-dimensional pivot table summarizes data in only a row or a column. Let's have a problem statement first, and later we will solve it with the help of our pivot table. Problem statement. We have a data set of export products. We are asked to find out the number of times an export amount of a product has been listed in the data set. Pivot table on a new sheet. Let's click on a cell on our data set and create a pivot table. Let's create the pivot table on a new sheet. First, identify the fields you require. We need the amount field and the product field to solve our problem. Let's first list the products as rows. You can also list them as columns if you like. In the mathematical area or values area, drop the field amount, right-click on the cell of the mathematical section and a tab appears. Value field settings. You can choose how you want to display the values. Let's display it as a count. And there we have it. Broccoli amount appears 27 times in the data set. Using filters in pivot table. In the Filters tab, drag and drop the country field, as we want to see how many times the amount of these products is displayed for France. As we filter the table, we get the results like this. Pivot table example 2. Two-dimensional pivot table. A two-dimensional pivot table summarizes data in both rows and columns, probably when we have a larger data set or a problem statement. Let's understand this with another problem statement. We have another data set of safety data. There have been multiple incidents on various plants in various states in the US. What is the cost of incidents in each state? Creating pivot table on existing sheet. First create the pivot table and let's create the table on the existing sheet this time. We need to set a reference position for our table so that it knows where to start building. Interchange of rows and columns. Let's drag the incident to rows and plants to columns. Remember, they can always be interchanged and added or removed with drag and drop. I have interchanged rows and columns. Next, drop the field you want to know the value of here in the math section. Like I want the total cost or sum of the cost of incidents in plants of various states. Drill down. We can double-click any cell to find its details and learn more about how it was classified. Like I click the burns incident in California to find a different spreadsheet of its details. This is called drill down. Input value of empty cell as 0. Next, I can also add a filter to it. Let's say I want to filter it gender-wise. So I drag and drop it and filter it to females. Now you can see that there are a few areas in the values section where the cells are blank. It means that there is no data available for display here. But if you right-click on the cell and choose Setting, now you can choose the value of empty cell as 0 to get a chart with no empty values. Pivot table example 3. Let's take another example and problem statement. Suppose we have a data set of student exam records. We need to know the number of times a SAT score appears in our data set for graduates of age group 18 to 22. Now, with the huge data set that we have, it will be difficult to manually count the number of times the score appears. We can get the required data in seconds. Let's create the pivot table now. Drag student status to rows, age to columns, SAT score to values. Grouping rows or columns in the pivot table. Let's first click on the column and right-click. Go to Groups and make age groups by specifying the starting value of age, the ending age and the difference between age groups. You can click on the mathematical area and change the values to count. Because we want to know the number of times a score has appeared, as you can see from the table, a SAT score for an undergraduate student of age group 18 to 22 appears 15 times in the table. If we further want to classify between male and female students, then we could add a gender field to the Filters tab. Now I can easily tell what the SAT score for undergraduate women of age group 18 to 22 appears 10 times in our data set. Creating a pivot table chart on a new sheet. Select the pivot table and press F11 to create a chart of your pivot table. Design of pivot table. As we click on the pivot table, a tab on the top ribbon appears, the Design tab. From the Design tab, we can change the structure or look of our pivot table. I can choose from the pivot table styles how I want my table to look. I can choose different colors. Next, I can turn on or off checkboxes and see how it affects my table. Have a look. Row headers, column headers, banded rows and banded columns. Mark your rows and columns alternatively. Further next is the Layout tab, where you can choose the layout by adding or removing blank rows. Or select the report layout. The default layout is the compact form, but since I do not understand what the row label and column label means, I can change my layout to outline form, and now I can see that the row label and column labels have changed to student status and age. Similarly, you can see that there is a grand total at the end of each row and column. You also get options to choose to keep the grand totals for either both rows and columns, or one of the rows and columns, or none of the rows and columns.